David had been staring at himself in the bathroom mirror for 10 minutes now. The same routine every morning for 3 years. He would look at the right side of his face first, the normal side. Then slowly, he would turn to see the left side. The scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, like a lightning bolt frozen in time. He touched the raised skin gently. It didn't hurt anymore, not physically. But the memory still came flooding back. The sound of metal snapping, sudden pain, the blood, the rush to the hospital. The doctor saying he was lucky to be alive. Lucky. That word always made him laugh, but not in a good way. David worked at a construction site back then. He was good at his job, respected by his team. Everyone looked up to him. He was the guy who could fix anything, solve any problem. Then one Tuesday morning, a steel cable under too much pressure finally gave way. In less than a second, his whole life changed. The first few months after the accident were the hardest. People would stare and then quickly look away. Some would whisper to their friends. Others would just freeze, not knowing what to say. David learned to read faces quickly. He could tell the difference between curiosity, pity, and fear. His friends tried to help at first. They would invite him out, tell him everything would be okay. But David could see it in their eyes too. They were uncomfortable. They didn't know how to act around him anymore. Slowly, the invitations stopped coming. Dating became impossible. David tried a few times. He would match with someone online, chat for days, even weeks. Things would go well until they wanted to video call or meet in person, then silence. Always silence. He remembered one particular conversation with a woman he had been talking to for almost a month. They had so much in common. She loved hiking. Just like him, she enjoyed the same movies, the same music. When she finally asked to meet, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe this time would be different. They met at a small coffee shop downtown. David arrived early and chose a corner table. He positioned himself so his good side faced the entrance. When she walked in, he waved. She smiled and started walking over. Then she saw his face fully. Her smile faded. She sat down, but David could tell she was already planning her exit. Conversation was polite, but cold. She left after 20 minutes, claiming she had forgotten about another appointment. David never heard from her again. After that, he stopped trying. It seemed easier to just accept that some things weren't meant for him anymore. Love, companionship, even simple friendships, they all belonged to his old life. His sister Jenny worried about him constantly. She would call every few days, always, with the same questions. Are you eating well? You getting out? You should meet some people. David loved his sister, but he wished she would understand. He had tried getting out. He had tried meeting people. It always ended the same way. Last week, Jenny called with different news. She was getting married. David felt genuinely happy for her. Jenny deserved all the good things in life. God. But then came the part he was dreading. I'm having an engagement. Party next Saturday, she said. I really want you to be there, please, David. You're my brother. It wouldn't be the same without you. David wanted to say no. He had become an expert at finding excuses. Work commitments, feeling under the weather. Car trouble, he had used them all. But this was different. This was Jenny's special day. I'll be there, he heard himself saying. The party was at Jenny's apartment. When David arrived, the place was already full of people. Laughter echoed from every corner. Groups of friends chatted over drinks. Couples shared quiet conversations. Everyone looked so normal, so comfortable in their own skin. David found a spot near the kitchen, away from the main crowd. He could see Jenny across the room glowing with happiness. Her future husband was by her side, and they looked perfect together. For a moment, David remembered what it felt like to dream about moments like that. David, you came. Jenny rushed over and hugged him tight. I'm so happy you're here. Wouldn't miss it, David said, forcing a smile. Jenny started introducing him to people. David watched their faces carefully. Some hid their surprise better than others. There were polite smiles, awkward pauses, and the inevitable moment when people would glance at his scar and then immediately look away. One of Jenny's friends, trying to be kind, asked David about his work. Another asked if he was seeing anyone. David gave short answers, tried to be polite, but inside he was counting the minutes until he could leave. He spent most of the evening moving from one quiet corner to another. When people approached, he would angle his face away, showing only his good side. It had become second nature, like breathing. Near the end of the party, David overheard two women talking near the bathroom. They didn't know he was listening. That's Jenny's brother, one said. Poor guy. She told me about the accident. It's so sad, the other replied. He used to be really good looking. Jenny showed me old photos. David felt his chest tighten. He knew they meant well, but their words hit harder than any cruel comment ever could. They were talking about him like he was already gone, like the person he used to be had died in that accident. He left the party early, telling Jenny he had a headache. She looked concerned but didn't push. David drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past his window. Back in his apartment, David sat in his favorite chair and looked around. The walls were bare. No photos of friends or family, no artwork or decorations, just white walls and basic furniture. Even his home had become a reflection of how he felt inside, empty and colorless. He picked up his phone and scrolled through. Social media, photos of happy couples, families on vacation, friends at parties. Everyone seemed to be living full, rich lives. David used to post photos too. Pictures from hiking trips, nights out with friends, moments of joy and adventure. His last post was from 4 years ago, before the accident. That night, David made a decision. He would stop pretending that things might get better. He would stop, hoping for something different. This was his life now, and the sooner he accepted it, the less it would hurt. He had no idea that in just 2 weeks, a chance encounter at a museum would change everything he believed about himself and his future. 2 weeks after Jenny's engagement party, David woke up feeling restless. It was a Tuesday morning, and he had nowhere to be. His work schedule was light this week, and the thought of spending another day alone in his apartment felt unbearable. He had been working from home as a freelance consultant since the accident. It was easier that way. No office meetings, no water cooler conversations, no awkward encounters in hallways. Just him, his computer, and the safety of his own space. But today felt different. Maybe it was the sunshine streaming through his window, or maybe he was just tired of the same 4 walls. Either way, David found himself getting dressed and heading. Out the door, he drove around the city for a while, not really knowing where to go. Most places made him uncomfortable now. Restaurants were too crowded, parks had too many families, and shopping centers were full of teenagers who stared without. Trying to hide it, then he remembered the Natural History Museum. He had loved going there as a kid with his parents. It was usually quiet during weekday mornings, and people would be focused on the exhibits rather than on him. Perfect. The museum was exactly as he remembered. High ceilings, dim lighting, and the comforting smell of old wood and preserved specimens. David paid his entrance fee and grabbed a map, though he didn't really need one. He knew exactly where he wanted to go. The human evolution exhibit had always been his favorite. Something about seeing how humans had changed over millions of years fascinated him. Maybe it was because it reminded him that everyone was different, that change was natural, that no one was supposed to look exactly the same. David made his way through the dinosaur section, past the mineral displays, and into the quieter wing where the human exhibits were located. As expected, this section was nearly empty. Just a few serious-looking visitors, taking notes and reading every single plaque. He stopped in front of a display showing facial reconstructions of early humans. The scientists had taken ancient skulls and built faces on them, showing what these people might have looked like thousands of years ago. Some faces were beautiful, others were rough or weathered. Each one told a story of survival. David was reading about how these reconstructions were made when he noticed someone approaching the same display. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. She was small and moved very carefully, like she was being extra cautious about where she stepped. What struck David most were her eyes. They were an unusual pale blue color, almost white in the museum's lighting. She was wearing dark sunglasses indoors, which seemed odd, but David had learned not to judge people for their choices. She came to stand right next to him at the display. David tensed up, waiting for the usual reaction. But when she glanced his way, she simply nodded politely and turned back to reading the exhibit information. David watched her from the corner of his eye. She was holding the information plaque very close to her face, squinting to read it. She would read a section, then pull out a small notebook and write something down. Her handwriting was careful and neat, like she was taking great care with each word. After a few minutes, she moved to the next display. David found himself following the same path, staying a respectful distance behind. There was something peaceful about watching someone else who seemed truly interested in what they were seeing. The woman stopped at every single exhibit. She would read the descriptions slowly, take notes, and sometimes stand back to look at the displays from different angles. David realized she was probably a student or a researcher of some kind. At one point, she stopped in front of a display that was mounted higher on the wall than the others. David could see her struggling to read the text, even with her face tilted up and the plaque held close to her eyes. She tried standing on her tiptoes, but it wasn't helping. David hesitated. He had spent 3 years avoiding interactions with strangers. But watching her struggle felt wrong. Before he could talk himself out of it, he approached. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Would you like me to read that for you?" She turned toward him, and David automatically positioned himself so his good side faced her. Up close, he could see that her eyes were even more unusual than he had first thought. They were very pale, with pupils that seemed to react differently to light than normal eyes. "That would be really helpful, thank you," she said, with a genuine smile. Her voice was soft but confident. David read the plaque aloud. It was about how early humans used tools to modify their appearance, including decorative scarring for ceremonies and status symbols. As he read, he noticed that the woman was listening intently, occasionally asking him to repeat certain parts. "This is fascinating," she said when he finished. "I'm writing my thesis on how physical differences shaped social interactions in ancient cultures. This exhibit is perfect for my research." "That sounds like interesting work," David said. He was surprised by how natural the conversation felt. "I'm studying anthropology," she continued. "Specifically, I'm looking at how societies throughout history have dealt with people who look different from the norm. It's amazing how much attitudes have changed over time." David felt a strange flutter in his chest. Here was someone who spent her time thinking about differences, about how people were treated because of how they looked. And she was talking to him like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Are you interested in anthropology?" she asked. "Not really," David admitted. "I just like coming here. It's peaceful." She nodded knowingly. "I understand. Museums are some of the few places where you can think without interruption." They walked through the rest of the exhibit together. David found himself reading more plaques aloud, and she would share interesting facts from her research. She told him about ancient cultures that saw scars as marks of honor, about societies where physical differences were considered signs of wisdom or spiritual connection. "It's funny," she said as they stood in front of a display about facial modifications in different cultures. "We think we're so advanced now, but in many ways, ancient people were much more accepting of physical differences than we are today." David felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years, he was having a real conversation with someone who didn't seem bothered by his appearance. In fact, she seemed genuinely interested in the topic of human differences. As they reached the end of the exhibit, David realized he didn't want the conversation to end, but he also didn't want to push his luck. This had been the first positive interaction he'd had with a stranger in years. "Thank you for reading those plaques for me," she said. "It really helped with my research." "You're welcome," David replied. "Good luck with your thesis." She smiled and started to walk away. Then she turned back. "I'm usually here on Tuesday mornings doing research," she said. "If you're ever here again and see me struggling with the high displays, please don't hesitate to help." David watched her walk away, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, just maybe, there were people in the world who could see past the surface and appreciate what lay beneath. He left the museum that day with a lighter step than he'd had in months. And for the first time in 3 years, he was already planning his next visit. The following Tuesday, David found himself getting ready earlier than usual. He told himself he was just going to the museum for another peaceful morning. but deep down, he knew he was hoping to see the young woman again. He arrived at the museum just as it opened, purchasing his ticket from the same elderly clerk who barely looked up from her newspaper. The halls were even quieter than last week, with only a few dedicated researchers and early morning visitors scattered throughout the building. David made his way to the human evolution section, his heart beating a little faster than normal. If she wasn't there? What if she was there but didn't remember him? What if she had just been polite last week and didn't actually want to see him again? But as he rounded the corner into the main exhibition hall, he saw her. She was standing in front of a display about ancient burial practices, her notebook open and her face close to the information plaque. She was wearing the same dark sunglasses and moving with the same careful, deliberate steps. David watched her for a moment, unsure of how to approach. Should he say hello? Should he wait for her to notice him before he could decide? She looked up and saw him. "Oh, hello," she said with a genuine smile. "You're back." "Yeah, I told you I liked coming here," David replied, feeling more relaxed than he had expected. "How's the research going?" "Really well, actually. I found some fascinating information about how different cultures viewed physical markings and modifications. Would you like to see?" For the next hour, they walked through the exhibits together. David found himself genuinely interested in what she was studying. She showed him examples of cultures where scars were considered beautiful, where unusual physical features were seen as gifts from the gods, where being different was a source of respect rather than shame. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a display about ancient Egyptian practices. They believed that physical marks told the story of a person's journey through life. Scars, birthmarks, even missing limbs were seen as chapters in their personal history. David found himself leaning in closer to read the display. Without thinking, he had positioned himself so she could see his full face, scar and all. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't hiding. "That's beautiful," he said. "I never thought about it that way. Most people don't," she replied. "We're so focused on looking perfect that we forget every mark on our body tells a story of survival." They moved to another exhibit, this one about facial reconstruction techniques used by modern archaeologists. David watched as she took detailed notes, occasionally asking him to read sections that were mounted too high for her to see clearly. "Can I ask you something?" David said as they stood in front of a display showing how scientists rebuild faces from ancient skulls. "Of course, your research, your thesis, is it personal for you?" She paused for a moment, then slowly removed her dark sunglasses. David had seen her eyes before, but now in the clearer light of this section of the museum, he could see them more clearly. They were striking and beautiful, but obviously different from typical eyes. The pupils were unusually large and seemed to react slowly to changes in light. "I have a condition called albinism," she said quietly. "It affects the pigmentation in my eyes and skin, and it causes vision problems. I've been dealing with stares and questions my whole life." David felt something shift inside his chest. Here was someone who truly understood what it was like to be looked at as different, to be judged by appearance before anyone knew who you were as a person. "I'm sorry," he said. "People can be ... cruel, ignorant, curious," she finished. "Yes, they can be, but they can also be kind, understanding, and accepting. The key is learning to tell the difference." David nodded, feeling a connection he hadn't expected. For the first time since his accident, he was talking to someone who really understood his experience. "What about you?" she asked gently. "A story behind why you come here for peace." David hesitated. He had spent 3 years avoiding this conversation, deflecting questions, changing the subject. But something about her openness, her genuine interest, made him want to share. "I had an accident," he said simply. "At work 3 years ago." He turned his head slightly, showing her his scar fully for the first time. He waited for the usual reaction, the sharp intake of breath, the look of pity or discomfort, the awkward silence that followed. Instead, she looked at his face with the same careful attention she had been giving to the museum exhibits. Her unusual eyes studied the scar, not with shock or pity, but with something that looked like understanding. "Construction. Accident?" she asked. "Yeah. A cable snapped. I was lucky to survive." "Lucky," she repeated thoughtfully. That's a word people use a lot when they don't know what else to say, isn't it? David was surprised by how accurately she had captured his feelings. Exactly, everyone says I'm lucky to be alive, but ... But being alive and feeling truly alive are two different things, she finished. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking at the display in front of them. It showed how ancient cultures honored their wounded warriors, how scars were seen as proof of courage and survival. You know what I find interesting about these exhibits? She said. They show us that the way we think about physical differences isn't natural or inevitable. It's learned, it's cultural. And if it's learned, it can be unlearned. Do you really believe that? David asked. I have to, she said with a small smile. Otherwise, what's the point of studying all this history? What's the point of understanding how much better we could be? They continued walking through the museum, their conversation flowing more naturally than any David had experienced in years. She told him about her research, about the challenges of studying with vision problems, about professors who doubted her abilities, and classmates who treated her like she was fragile. David found himself sharing stories too, about his work, about how different life had become since the accident, about the loneliness he had been carrying for 3 years. Can I tell you something? She said as they stood in front of the museum's cafe. When I first saw you last week, I didn't notice your scar. What do you mean? I saw it, but it wasn't the first thing I noticed about you. The first thing I noticed was that you were kind enough to offer help to a stranger, that you were patient when I was struggling to read the displays, that you seemed genuinely interested in learning. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. He couldn't remember the last time someone had described him in terms of his character rather than his appearance. Most people see the scar first, he said quietly. Most people see my eyes first too, she replied. But the people worth knowing see past the surface. They see the person underneath. As they reached the museum cafe, David realized he didn't want their conversation to end. For the first time in 3 years, he was talking to someone who made him feel like himself again. Someone who understood what it was like to be different, to be judged, to be reduced to a single physical characteristic. Would you like to get some coffee? He asked, surprised by his own courage. I'd like that very much, she said, as they walked into the cafe together. David felt something he had forgotten was possible. He felt hope, it's not just for this moment, but for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there were people in the world who could see beyond the surface and appreciate what lay beneath. The museum cafe was nearly empty, with just a few visitors scattered at small round tables. David chose a table near the window, where natural light streamed in, but the corner location still felt private. For the first time in 3 years, he sat directly across from someone, instead of positioning himself to hide his profile. I love this place, she said, settling into her chair and placing her notebook on the table. It's quiet and the lighting is good enough for me to read without straining too much. David watched as she carefully removed her dark sunglasses and set them aside. Her pale eyes caught the light from the window, and he could see how they moved differently than his own, tracking more slowly as she looked around the cafe. Can I ask about your condition? Right, David said. If you don't mind talking about it. I don't mind at all, she replied, stirring sugar into her coffee. I have what's called oculocutaneous albinism. It affects the production of melanin in my body, which is why my eyes and skin are so pale. It also causes vision problems. I'm legally blind, though I can see well enough to get around. David found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested. How long have you been dealing with it? My whole life. I was born this way, she said with a small smile. My parents were amazing about it, but school was tough. Kids would call me names, make up stories about why I looked different.
Awesome.
Thought I was sick. Others thought I was some kind of alien. Alien, David repeated thoughtfully. Kids can be cruel. They can be. But they can also be surprisingly accepting when adults show them how. The problem is, most adults don't know how to react to differences either. She took a sip of her coffee and continued. I remember one teacher in middle school who made all the difference. Instead of trying to hide my condition or make me feel ashamed, she used it as a teaching moment. She had the class learn about different types of genetic conditions, about how diversity makes us stronger as a species. That sounds like an amazing teacher. She taught me that being different wasn't something to apologize for. It was just another way of being human. David felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had spent 3 years apologizing for his appearance, hiding from the world, convincing himself that he was less valuable because of his scar. Wish I had met someone like that after my accident, he said quietly. Tell me about it, she said gently. The accident, I mean. If you want to. David hesitated. He had never told anyone the full story, not his family, not his friends, not even the counselors the hospital had recommended. But something about her openness, her genuine interest, made him want to share. I was working on a high-rise construction project, he began. We were installing support cables for a new section of the building. I had done the same job hundreds of times before. He paused, remembering that day with painful clarity. The cable was under more tension than we realized. When it snapped, it whipped across my face before I could react. Had hit me 2 inches lower, it would have killed me. How long were you in the hospital? 3 weeks? Multiple surgeries to repair the damage. The doctors did their best, but he gestured to his scar. This was the best they could do. And after you recovered? David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Recovered. That's what everyone kept saying. You're recovering so well. You're lucky to be recovering. But I didn't feel like I was recovering. Felt like I had lost. Something that I could never get back. What did you lose? It's a question caught David off guard. He had expected sympathy, maybe pity, but not this direct question that cut straight to the heart of his pain. My confidence, I guess. My sense of who I was. Before the accident, I was the guy people came to for help. I was social, outgoing. I dated. I had friends. I felt comfortable in my own skin. And after, I became the guy people stared at. The guy who made others uncomfortable. I tried to date, but every time someone saw my face, I could see them shut down. I tried to maintain friendships, but people didn't know how to act around me anymore. She nodded thoughtfully. It's strange how one moment can change everything, isn't it? Not just physically, but emotionally, socially. Exactly. And the worst part is, everyone kept telling me I was the same person inside. But I didn't feel like the same person. Felt like someone completely different. You know what I think? She said, looking directly at him with those unusual pale eyes. I think you are different. The accident changed you, just like living. With albinism has changed me, but different doesn't mean less valuable. Different doesn't mean broken. David felt something shift inside him as she spoke. For 3 years he had been trying to get back to who he used to be, trying to pretend. The accident hadn't changed him, but maybe that was the wrong approach. In my research, she continued, I've learned that trauma often creates the most interesting people. The ancient cultures I study understood this. They knew that people who had survived difficult experiences often became the wisest, the most compassionate, the most valuable members of their communities. I don't feel wise or compassionate, David said. I feel angry and isolated. Of course you do. You've been through something traumatic, and instead of being supported, you've been made to feel like you should hide your experience. That's not healing. That's shame. David felt his eyes beginning to water. God. No one had ever put his experience into words so clearly before. Can I tell you something? She said, reaching across the table. She didn't touch him, but her hand was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. When I first saw you last week, I didn't see someone who was damaged or broken. I saw someone who was carrying pain but was still kind enough to help a stranger. That tells me more about your character than any physical appearance ever could. But people see the scar first, David said. They always will. Some people will, she agreed. Dad. But the people who matter, the people worth knowing, they'll see past it. They'll see the person who survived something terrible and is still here, still fighting, still capable of kindness. David looked at her pale eyes, so different from anyone else's, and realized something profound. She wasn't just talking about his scar. She was talking about her own experience of being judged, of being reduced to her physical differences, of fighting to be seen as a complete person. How do you do it? He asked. How do you stay positive when people treat you differently? Don't always, she admitted. Some days are harder than others, but I've learned that I have a choice. I can let other people's ignorance define me, or I can define myself. And how do you define yourself? She smiled, and for the first time since his accident, David saw something in someone's eyes that wasn't pity or discomfort. It was recognition, understanding, and something that looked very much like hope. I define myself as someone who has learned to see beyond the surface, she said. Someone who understands that real beauty comes from surviving life's challenges and still choosing to be kind. Someone who knows that being different is not a flaw to be fixed, but a strength to be celebrated. As they sat in the quiet cafe, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. He felt understood, not just accepted, but truly understood by someone who knew what it was like to be different, to be judged, to be reduced to a single physical characteristic. For the first time since his accident, David began to wonder if, maybe, just maybe, there was a way to not just survive his new life, but to actually live it. 6 months had passed since that first conversation in the museum cafe. David still remembered every word of that afternoon. How something had shifted inside him when she spoke about defining yourself instead of letting others define you. It had been the beginning of a friendship that slowly became something more. Her name was Luna, and she had become the most important person in his life. Not because she fixed him. David had learned that he wasn't broken, but because she helped him see himself through different eyes. They met every Tuesday at the museum, their routine as comfortable as breathing. Luna would work on her research while David helped read the displays that were too high or too difficult for her to see clearly. What had started as simple assistance had grown into genuine collaboration. I have an idea, Luna had said one Tuesday. In March, what if we worked together on a project? Your construction background and my research could create something really special. The idea had been to design museum exhibits that were accessible to people with different vision abilities. David's practical knowledge of building and materials, combined with Luna's understanding of how people with vision impairments interacted with information, created a perfect partnership. They spent weeks developing prototypes, meeting with museum directors and refining their designs. David found himself more energized than he had been in years. For the first time since his accident, he was using his skills to create something meaningful. Look at this, Luna said, running her hands over their latest design. It was a tactile display that allowed visitors to feel the texture of different materials, while reading information in both standard text and braille. This is going to change how people experience museums. David watched her face light up with excitement. Over the months, he had learned to read her expressions, to understand how her unusual eyes conveyed emotion. When she was happy, they seemed to catch light in a way that made them almost luminous. Make a good team, he said, and meant it in more ways than one. Their working relationship had naturally evolved into something deeper. Luna had never treated David's scar as something to be ignored or overcome. Instead, she approached it the same way she approached everything else, with curiosity, acceptance, and genuine interest in the story it told. May I? She had asked one day, gesturing toward his scar. They had been sitting in his apartment, working on grant applications for their museum project. David had nodded, his heart racing. No one had touched his scar since the doctors who had treated it. Luna's fingers were gentle as they traced the air just above the raised skin, never actually touching but acknowledging its presence. It's beautiful, she had said quietly. Beautiful. David had been genuinely confused. It tells a story of survival, of strength, of someone who faced something terrible and lived to tell about it. How is that not beautiful? That was the moment David realized he was falling in love with her. Not because she accepted his scar, but because she helped him see it as part of his story rather than the end of it. Today was special. They were presenting their collaborative work to the board of directors at the Metropolitan Museum. Spent the morning getting ready, and for the first time in 3 years, he hadn't positioned himself in front of the mirror to hide his scar. Instead, he had looked at his whole face, seeing it as Luna had taught him to see it, as the face of someone who had survived, who had learned, who had grown. Are you ready for this? Luna asked as they stood outside the museum's conference room. I think so, David said. Are you? She smiled, her pale eyes bright with excitement. I've been ready for this my whole life. The presentation went better than either of them had hoped. The board members were fascinated by their designs, impressed by the research behind them, and enthusiastic about implementing the changes throughout the museum. This is groundbreaking work, the museum director said as they wrapped up. You've created something that will make our exhibits accessible to so many more people. After the meeting, David and Luna walked through the museum where they had first met. The human evolution exhibit looked the same, but David felt completely different from the isolated man who had wandered these halls 6 months ago. I have something to tell you, Luna said as they stood in front of the display where David had first offered to help her. What's that? I've been thinking about what you said that first day in the cafe, about losing your sense of who you were after the accident. David nodded, remembering how raw and painful that conversation had been. I think you were right. You did lose who you were, but you found someone better. What do you mean? The David I met 6 months ago was someone who understood pain, who had learned empathy through his own struggles. He was someone who could see past surface appearances because he knew what it felt like to be judged for them. He was someone who had developed the kind of depth and compassion that only comes from surviving difficulty. David felt his throat tightened with emotion. I never thought about it that way. The old David might have been confident and social, but would he have stopped to help a stranger in a museum? Would he have understood the importance of making spaces accessible to everyone? Would he have seen past my unusual eyes to the person underneath? David realized she was right. His accident had taken away his old life, but it had also given him something new. It had given him the ability to connect with people who felt different, overlooked, or misunderstood. You know what I think? Luna continued. I think everything that happened to you led you to this moment, to this work we're doing together, to this person you've become. Are you saying you're glad I had the accident? I'm saying I'm glad you survived it. I'm glad you found a way to turn your pain into something beautiful. I'm glad you learned to see yourself the way I see you. Luna stepped closer, her unusual eyes meeting his directly. I see someone who has learned that. Real strength comes from vulnerability. Someone who knows that being different is not a flaw to be hidden, but a gift to be shared. Someone who understands that the most beautiful people are the ones who have survived something difficult and chosen to use that experience to help others. David felt tears forming in his eyes. For 3 years, he had seen his scar as a symbol of everything he had lost, but Luna had helped him see it as a symbol of everything he had gained. I love you, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. I love you too, she replied without hesitation. I love your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. I love the way you see the world, the way you've learned to see beauty in unexpected places. I love your scar because it's part of the story that made you who you are. As they stood in the museum where they had first met, David realized that his accident hadn't been the end of his story. It had been the beginning of a new chapter, one that included love, purpose, and the understanding that being different was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. 6 months later, David and Luna were featured in a magazine article about their innovative museum designs. The photos showed them standing next to one of their tactile exhibits, both smiling genuinely at the camera. David's scar was clearly visible, but it was just one part of a face that radiated confidence and happiness. The article's headline read, "When different perspectives create beautiful solutions." It was a perfect description of what they had built together, not just their museum exhibits, but their relationship and their understanding of what it meant to be human. David kept a copy of the article on his desk, not because of the recognition, but because it reminded him of something Luna had taught him. Everyone has scars, visible or invisible. The question is not whether you have them, what you choose to do with the story they tell. And David had chosen to turn his story into something beautiful,